Hi, so welcome back once again. So this time I'm going to be covering still section 2 of AWS security services, which consist of the services that do the detection in continuous monitoring. In the previous video, we covered Inspector Guard Duty in CloudTrail, and we were using ChatGPT to complement the slides. With some explanations from there. So this time I will be doing a CloudWatch and how it works. So without further ado, let's just dig into it, right? So, okay, so here you go. I am going to move this thing a little bit here so we see what's happening here. So now what I did was I dropped some 30 plus AWS services, and now I will say why I have it there. Then I have CloudWatch. I have CloudWatch logs and I have config. So config is now a new service, but I'm going to say how they work. So CloudWatch is collecting logs from 30 plus AWS services, and then that CloudWatch is actually going to send it's finding either to an S3 bucket or it's going to be sending it to some other services for further analysis, right? So what's happening is, so it's sending its CloudWatch to CloudWatch logs, which is native to CloudWatch itself, which does certain analysis. And then also, I would say optionally or alternatively, it sends those logs to an S3 bucket to store it, for example, or archive it, or maybe use that in S3 bucket, or the logs put in that S3 bucket can be sent to some other AWS services for further analysis, right? So, and then similarly, the findings that are being collected from config are being sent to an S3 as well. So I will talk about the config in a bit, but for now, at least as we were doing, we are putting those services first. Then we put a nice question into ChatGPT to give us I would say more details with a case scenario. And then we will come again, I would say with a summary to see how those services work together, right? So before we go into ChatGPT, I'm going to say one simple thing to differentiate between what a CloudWatch does, what a config does, and what a CloudTrail does. So usually what happens is we kind of confuse them with each other. So for example, what CloudTrail mainly is doing is who made the call. So who happened to send a certain request to an AWS environment. So who made the API call is done through the CloudTrail, and then CloudWatch is actually how are the services performing? Is everything going well with them? This kind of monitoring for performance of what's happening. And then config is what changes were made, right? So for example, if I gave an example, so not sure what example to give, but imagine that I am going into a restaurant, right? So there is a person actually standing at the door, and then they say which guest actually came in and which guests actually left, right? So that's what a CloudTrail will be monitoring, right? And then what CloudWatch is doing is actually going to each single table, and then they're asking the guests if everything is going well with the service, right? So that's what a CloudWatch will be doing. And then config would be actually what changes were made, right? So by change, I mean which dishes were being put in front of the guests, or maybe that wouldn't be a good example. So maybe if certain things are being changed, for example, there was a certain setting of the table and chairs inside the restaurant. If those settings were being changed, config is going to monitor that. Or for example, before we used to offer certain dishes and meals, now those dishes and meals were being, I would say, replaced with a different thing, or certain dishes were removed or certain dishes were added. So any changes that are being made is done through the config, right? So that's how you can remember. I'm standing at a restaurant. There is a person who is going to monitor which guests are entering the restaurant, which guests are leaving. That's what a CloudTrail is doing. In this case, who is making the API calls to AWS environment. And then CloudWatch is actually the guy going to each table or to each guest and asking, how is everything coming along? Is everything going well? So that's what a CloudWatch is monitoring, if all the services are running smoothly. And then config is actually the person kind of monitoring what changes were made or which recipes were replaced with other certain recipes, or if the setting inside the restaurants were changed. So that's how you can differentiate those services from each other. So now I wanted to put, I would say, a question into ChatGPT. This time I'm going to keep it a bit simple. Because we already got to know how it works. So I am going to put one question, how to differentiate those services. So config, CloudTrail, and CloudWatch. I know you got the, I would say, a little bit understanding through the example that I give, but still, let's see what's going to happen. Okay. So now they're going to give us some explanation, but the question is how the CloudWatch, CloudTrail, and config are different and similar from each other, and give a scenario example, right? So CloudWatch, CloudTrail, and config are different AWS services with distinct functionalities, but can be used together to provide comprehensive monitoring, logging, and configuration. So monitoring, when you heard the word monitoring, it's CloudWatch. When you hear the word kind of logging, also is for the CloudWatch, but if it's for the API calls, always if something you hear about the API calls, they talk about the CloudTrail. And if it's actually configuration management, always think about the config. Configuration management for the config, logging in monitoring for CloudWatch, and API calls is actually for CloudTrail, right? So again, here it's a little bit description. So CloudWatch is a monitoring service that collects metrics, logs, and events from your AWS resources and application. It allows you to set alarms based on specific conditions, which we kind of talk about in here. In the CloudWatch primarily focuses on performance monitoring and operation health. So similar to the CloudWatch, going to each separate guest or table in a restaurant, asking if everything is going well, right? So now we have CloudTrail. So CloudTrail is a service that requires AWS API calls made to your account and delivers the log files to an Amazon S3 bucket, and CloudTrail logs provide visibility into user activity, enabling you to track changes to your AWS resources, detect potential security threats, and then it primarily focuses on auditing and compliance. So CloudTrail, auditing and compliance, performance in monitoring and operation health for CloudWatch. And then if you go for the config, right? So config is a service that provides detailed view of your AWS resources, configuration, and relationship. It continuously monitors and records your resources configuration and evaluates them against the desired configuration you define. So config primarily focus on configuration management and compliance. So it's the same thing. The config is actually seeing the guy standing in the restaurants and checking if any settings for the tables were changed or any recipes were being replaced or added and removed from the cookbook, or maybe to in the restaurant kitchen, right? So let's go with the case scenario. And what it says is, suppose you have a web application running on an AWS using services like EC2, S3, RDS, and you wanted to monitor performance, track changes, and ensure compliance with your configuration policies, right? So it says that CloudWatch collects and analyzes metrics from your EC2 instance, S3 bucket, and RDS instance, set up alarms for specific threshold like CPU utilization on an EC2 instance, or increased error rates in your application, configure these alarms to send notification or trigger action, like scaling your EC2 instance or restarting a problematic service, right? And then CloudTrail is actually recording the API calls that's made by the users or services in your AWS account. This will help you track who made the changes to your resources, like creating or deleting an EC2 instance, or modifying an S3 bucket policy. So now you integrate the CloudTrail logs with CloudWatch logs to analyze the logs and set up alarms based on specific events like unauthorized access attempt, right? And then we have config. So what config is doing is monitor your resource configuration, continuously define desired configuration rules for your resources, such as required tags or specific security group settings. So config evaluate your resources against these rules and notify you when any non-compliant resource, helping you to maintain compliance with your configuration policies, right? So and the last part is, in summary, CloudWatch is performance and monitoring. CloudTrail is auditing, and config is configuration management, right? So basically that's, I would say, what it is. So we kind of did cover almost everything in here. So that's a wrap up for section 2 of AWS services that does the detection and continuous monitoring. Once again, we talked about the inspector services, we talked about the GuardDuty, CloudTrail, CloudWatch, and config, and then we talk about the differentiation between the CloudWatch, config, and CloudTrail, and then we had those other services like SNS and Lambda and CloudWatch events that are being triggered in response to certain things happening in those security services. So that's it, I would say, for now. Have a good evening, day, or night. And then I will be seeing you again in my upcoming videos. Bye for now.